this layers tutorial, we're going to breeze through a layers workflow in a very fast forward way. I don't want you to get too hung up on the technique, even though I show you briefly what I'm doing here. I'd rather you focused on the logic of the layers and the order they're created, the types of layers and their editing capabilities. The whole point of this is to arrive at a file that's a bit like a multi-track recording where you can edit any layer afterwards. And I suppose you could also see it as a little bit of a test of what you know about the capabilities of layers in Photoshop. I'm going to start with an unretouched image, just with a markup layer sitting above the background. This was simply a blank layer on which the markups were painted in. I'm going to turn off this layer by clicking off the eyeball and make myself a new layer. Command J to make a layer via copy there. The cloning is all about zapping and cleaning the most obvious. I also do a bit of work on the eyebrows on the retouching layer. Any subtle lightening and darkening is better left for the dodging and burning layers. Very often when I retouch, I make a curves layer just to darken it a little bit. This sits as an acetate almost above the image, making it easier to see what you're doing as you're working on a very bright image. Some retouchers prefer to clone and some prefer to dodge and burn. I like to do both, and I tend not to get too snobbish about method because it's not necessarily the method that matters, it's how you perform it. If you're going to combine techniques, the workflow and the layer order becomes much more important. And on that note, here's my next layer. This is a screen dodge layer. I created it by making a blank new layer and blending it to the screen blending mode. This will double the brightness of everything that I paint on. The advantage of this kind of dodging is that I can sample the colour of the skin and control the colour of my dodging. I just want to point out that this is dodge only, so no darkening on this layer. The way I work with this is a combination of dabbing and scribbling on small details with a very small brush and some smooth strokes with a big brush on low opacity. It's very important to keep the eyeball toggled off and on to see the progress of this work. In addition to this screen layer, I tend to do some combined dodging and burning on a neutral layer. Going to layer, new layer, I then make a soft light blending mode and fill with soft light neutral color 50% gray, and I call it dodge and burn. Then I usually press D to set my swatches to default. I've rotated the view of the image, pressing R, and just rotated the actual view to do some work here on the eyebrows. Just tiny little strokes with a darkening. I tend to put this combined dodge and burn layer above the screen layer to avoid any conflict. I toggle before and after, and just to show you what it looks like when I take off the soft light blending mode and blend it to normal, you'll see there that the eyebrows really stand out, and you see the combined work that I've done here. Turning off and on both of these layers, you see that it's made quite a difference there. I'm going to make an eyes layer, but the first thing I have to do is turn off the curves, because I'm now going to drag a marquee over the eyes to both sides of the face and Shift Command C to copy merge and Command V to paste. I'm making a neutral layer as before for a little bit of dodging and burning, and this is going to be only for the eyes. I'm clipping this layer to the eyes layer so that I can turn on and off the eyes layer only, and both layers will be turned off in the same operation. Now the way to clip a layer or group a layer to the layer below is Command Alt G, Command Option G. Now I'm using the layer here just to strengthen the lashes a little bit, using a dark colour to just darken the lighter lashes. And combined with a bit of work on the retouch eyes layer, you see the effect here. Above the dodge and burn layer for the eyes, I'm making a new blank layer, and this is also clipped to the eyes layer, and this is just for darkening or actually painting in some fictional lashes. I prefer to do this on a separate layer, firstly because it's actually painting using a paintbrush, and I apply a little bit of noise to it when I'm finished, and also so that I can edit that freely if I've gone a little bit overboard on the lashes there. Again, it's very important to toggle that eyeball on and off to see the full effect of the lashes. Now, I don't often do lashes, it's not something I make a habit of doing, but in this kind of image it suits the image. Now I'm going to make a little bit more contrast and depth of colour for the iris of the eye. So I'm taking a marquee tool and then a curves, making it as an adjustment layer, of course. And this is just a little test patch which I'm doing on the left eye as you see it, and then I make sure that I fill the mask and use a white gradient to mask this in, or to reveal it rather, in both the eyes. Even if I did the test patch in just one eye, I can do that. I also then make sure that any spill is masked off with a brush using a black foreground colour. I then combine all these layers for the eyes to an eyes group by highlighting this top layer and the eyes layer itself and pressing Command G. I give it the name Eyes. Here you can see I've got a ready-made path which I'm now going to load as a selection. Go into the quick mask and give that a little bit of softening through a Gaussian blur and go back to selection mode. Shift Command C, Command V, I make a copy and paste, and then Command J to duplicate that layer, which I then turn off the top layer of. I go back to the lowest of the two and do a little bit of cleaning up in the lips. I could have done this before I actually duplicated it. I'm turning on the duplicated layer again and giving it a surface blur, which gives it a little bit more softness but retains some shape. Don't worry, I'm not going to use all of it. Give it a bit of noise, which is something I generally always do when I blur something. I then use a layer mask which hides all. Now that means it hides the layer so that I can reveal it on the mask with a white brush, as I'm doing here now. I tend to first reveal it with a quite big soft brush and then bring some of the detail back by masking it a little bit there. Toggling before and after. I'm now going to reload the selection by command clicking on the layer. This is in order to make a curve which deepens and darkens just a little bit on the lips, and bringing it up a bit in the red channel and in the green channel slightly down, just to make it less green, more magenta. Note that the lips get a little bit dark around the edges, so we're going to mask just a little bit off that edge there, taking off by skimming with a big brush, big soft brush around the edges. You see I'm not going really into the lips much, I'm just skimming around the edge there. I'm now changing the names of these layers, lips retouching and blur, and calling this curve the richer colour. To group the layers, I can now highlight all these three layers by shift clicking them, Command G, to combine them into a lips group, which is what I rename it to. As you can see, the chin is maybe a little bit pointy from this angle, and there's a bump on the side of her face. And I'm going to transform first the chin, dragging a marquee, Shift Command C, Command V, going to the layer and smart object, converting it to a smart object, which means that if I need to do several transformations, I can do so non-destructively. Edit Transform Warp lets me transform within a grid. So I'm just pushing up the middle there, and that really helps. Let's have a look and see if that aligns well with the outside. That looks like it aligns really well, so that means that I don't have to mask this smart object. This time drawing a lasso, Shift Command C and Command V to paste, convert to smart object, and I'm doing this on a layer via copy, or rather a copy and paste layer, as I did before. So this one, I'm bending this little bump inwards, but you see I'm having a bit of trouble aligning it at the corners. So let's zoom in, and you see there a little bit of misalignment. I Alt-Option click on the mask button in the layers panel, and that gives me a mask that hides this new layer. And I take a paintbrush and white foreground color, and I just smooth this nicely in there, just where I need it. I'm going to make a group out of this, highlighting both the layers and calling it transforms. I'm planning on a color adjustment, in fact a channel mixer, so I'm looking at the channels here to see which one can give me some detail in the skin as I add a channel mixer adjustment. I'm changing to soft light, which gives me a bit too much vividness to go with the contrast, so I click the monochrome button, making the blue channel 70, trying out the green channel on 30 and the red on 10, and then changing the green channel to 20, which makes it all add up to 100, which is good practice. So what you see here is a good contrast, but maybe just a little bit too much. So I take the opacity of that layer down to about 60, 61 there. This is in fact our first so far global adjustment. I'm now going to make another adjustment, and this one's going to be a little bit more selective. So I'm making a test patch, and I've actually darkened it just a little bit and then filled the mask. And now I'm painting in this slightly darkening adjustment to the skin. If you've been keeping an eye on the layers panel, you'll see that the mask has been progressing from completely black to, you can just about see a kind of white face in there. Again, I've made a pen path which I'm going to load as a selection. You see the work path sitting in the path panel here. It's important to turn off the color adjustment layers for the next step, because I'm going to do a copy merged, which copies all the visible layers and would double up on the coloring of those adjustments if they were on. Shift Command C for copy merged, and then Command V to paste. I give the pasted layer a strong blur, and then I do a filter add noise at 0.75, which is a very low level of noise just to hold the blurred layer together. Loading the path again as a selection, I go into the quick mask and do a Gaussian blur to feather that edge. With the feather selection now active, attaching a mask to it will shave a little bit off the edges and soften that transition. Normally I do something to modify and lessen that blurred layer, but I just wanted to throw it completely out of focus, so for now I'm going to leave it and just rename the layer. I then turn the adjustment layers back on again. Now I make up a new blank layer and call it Hair Clean. On this layer I clean up the crosshairs with a clone tool and sometimes a little bit of brush tool. I then make two blank layers, one for the dark hairs and one for the light hairs, or highlight hairs should I say. Using a very small brush I manually stroke and fill in with a white colour or a dark colour on the respective layers. Of course this is not something you have to do on all images, but on this image the hair really needed to be smooth and shiny. When finished I make a hair grip, and that's Command G. We should be very careful with moving layers up and down the layer stack willy-nilly, but in this case I can see that the smooth neck layer can sit below the four groups, just to make it look a bit more tidy. Turning the colour adjustments off again, because I'm going to make a merge layer now, I click on the new layer button for a blank layer and do what's called a stamp visible, holding down Shift, Alt, Command E. This joins all the visible layers into one layer. From this layer I generate now a whole process that I call digital powder, ending up with this one layer, which I'm now showing at full opacity, As you can see, it tightens up the skin without making it look blurred. I can later take this down in opacity. Normally I use it at about 50%. I'm now going to make a neutral layer for shading. In principle, it's like a dodge and burn layer, and I create it much the same way. The difference is how I work with it. I use bigger brushes with the aim to create more shape and more dimension. I'm showing you here what I've actually done, and while I'm at it, I'm going to put some noise in to prevent the banding that you see. As you can see, the noise now prevents it from banding. At this point, we're getting close to the end of the linear workflow, but I feel the image needs a couple of adjustments. The first thing I want to deal with is the red saturation. So I'm going to use a hue saturation layer on top of the layer stack. I go straight into the reds range and use the left eyedropper to target this range more accurately. I'm doing a little bit of testing on the saturation slider before I end up with -28. To avoid over desaturating the lips and the brown eyes, I mask off with a bit of black brush. Earlier in the process, you may remember that I used a very simple darkening curve to see my cleanup work better. Just out of curiosity, I'm going to turn it on, and you know what? I like some of what it's doing, so I'm going to use it in parts of the image. So I fill the mask and take a massive airbrush with low opacity and flow and reveal the darkening adjustment slightly in the skin. You see, it brings out some of the dimensions that I talked about earlier. We're now at the end of this linear workflow, and I have a nice and tidy layer stack. The layers are fully editable, and it's almost like a music recording with lots of different tracks that I can fine-tune. Before I do any editing, I'm going to put the whole lot into a group, and I'm calling it Retouched. Just for a bit of instant gratification, I'm turning the group off just to see the original image below, which is of course still intact. I'm now going to expand the layer stack and see what we can do in terms of editing. I'm now going to get rid of layer 4, which is really just a temporary layer, and also it's obscuring the layers sitting below it. So when I, for example, turn off the eyes layer, you can't see any difference. Whereas if I remove this layer, which is obscuring the layers sitting under it, and turn off the eyes layer, of course you do then see a difference. Turning that back on again. As you can see, the removal of that layer hasn't visually changed the image because I didn't do any work on that layer whatsoever. Now I'm going to look at the digital powder, which was the layer that I generated from that merged layer 4. I'm going to start remasking it because I'm not happy with the mask that I did here. I'm going to just fill the mask and take a brush tool, switch my swatches around so I get white. The point is not to use it everywhere. The point is to use it where I actually need this layer. It's more a skin tightening layer than a skin smoothing layer, really. So here you have my new mask. I'm just going to turn the whole thing down just to about 77-78%. I really don't want that to have a lot of impact. The next layer I'm going to work on is the hue saturation layer, because I feel that maybe it's desaturated the lips a little bit too much. So I'm going to switch my swatches there and just mask off a little bit more in the lips. In fact here, because her edges tend to go a little bit brownish, I'm really going to go right to the edge here, taking it a little bit more back in the eyes as well. So we have this smiley face here. I feel that my shading layer might have gone a bit too far. It often happens that you get carried away, so I'm just going to take that down to about 80%. Finally, I'm going to go to this curve here, which darkened the skin, you remember. I'm also going to use it a little bit down here on the neck area, which I just want to really keep dark. And actually, while I'm at it, I think I'm going to just take that down in opacity a little bit, the neck area, so about 68% there. And going back to the curves layer, where I work in the mask, I'm just going to take a brush and X my swatches to reveal a bit of that adjustment, darkening a little bit more on the sides than the middle. I notice also that there's a slightly lighter spot there, so I'm going to just do a final little adjustment there and make myself a new curve, which I'm going to darken slightly in that area, fill it, brush it with a small brush, and maybe just darken it a little bit more there. The beauty of this approach to working with layers is that you have a very focused and linear style of working. Building the layer stack organically upwards, you can edit every single layer after the process without making any counter adjustments. This is now my master image and it's kept with all the layers intact. If I want to make a print version or a web version or a client checking version, I duplicate to get a flattened copy, which I can resize and sharpen, or use a high pass or whatever method you use for sharpening. The master retouch image gets backed up and will never be flattened. If you've had any trouble following the techniques, I don't blame you, but that's not the point of this tutorial. All the techniques are found in other tutorials in this DVD. This one is about layers and retouching workflow.